Good evening. Good evening and welcome. My name's Jackie Spainhour. I am the president and CEO of the Gettysburg Foundation. We own and operate this building, and we are the philanthropic partner of the National Park Service here at Gettysburg. So if I haven't had the pleasure to meet you, hi, nice to meet you. I would love to spend time and get to know why all of you are so interested in this program at another time, so feel free to reach out to me. So thank you all for joining us tonight for this very special program featuring a very notable guest who you will hear about shortly from my colleague at the National Park Service. I would like to take the opportunity to welcome you to this Museum and Visitor Center, which is one of the shared spaces of the Gettysburg Foundation and the National Park Service here at Gettysburg. It is a symbol of partnership and of stewardship and a place where visitors can engage with our shared history and find the relevance of those stories in our world today. The Eisenhower National Historic Site is also one such place. Eisenhower himself taught us the power of place and partnership in his message 80 years ago. While commemorating victory in Europe, General Eisenhower was sure to remind those under his command and the American people at home that victory was the result of an Allied effort. I find it fitting to tell you all tonight along those lines that it is the combined effort of the Gettysburg Foundation, the Gettysburg National Military Park, and Eisenhower National Historic Site, along with many others that make this event possible. I would like to sincerely thank our partners in preservation for allowing us, the Gettysburg Foundation, to be a supporter of this engaging program. Tonight, I have the distinct honor of introducing Chris Gwynn, the Chief of Interpretation and Education with the National Park Service here in Gettysburg. And I know he's just as excited as we are at the Foundation for the program tonight. So please help me in welcoming Chris Gwynn to the podium.
Thank you, Jackie. Good evening, everyone. So good to see you all here. As Jackie mentioned, my name is Christopher Gwynn, the Chief of Interpretation and Education here at the Battlefield Park. We're delighted to welcome you here to the Museum and Visitor Center, which we manage alongside Jackie and our wonderful team at the Gettysburg Foundation. Now, before we begin tonight, I would ask you that if you do have a cell phone, to please turn that to either off or silent, and also that we will be filming this presentation, so if you want to watch it again at another time, we'd encourage you to go to the National Park Service or Gettysburg Foundation social media outlets to see that. This evening, we are privileged to be joined by two individuals who exemplify excellence in historical interpretation and storytelling. First, allow me to introduce our moderator, Park Ranger Daniel Vermilya. Ranger Vermilya has served as an interpretive ranger with the National Park Service since 2010, with extensive experience at Antietam National Battlefield, Gettysburg National Military Park, and, of course, Eisenhower National Historic Site. Known for his creative programming and historical insight, he has developed dozens of public programs that help visitors engage meaningfully with the past. He's also the author of multiple works on the American Civil War era, and I would say that Dan, among many, but certainly Dan, has been one of the central individuals involved in the growth and continued excellence of World War II weekend at Eisenhower National Historic Site. So if you're enjoying this evening or any of the programs or living history over the next few days, you have in large part to thank Dan for that. I'd also add he's very humble. He asked me to keep his bio as short as possible, which I found that somewhat difficult to do. And now our featured guest, Rick Atkinson. Rick Atkinson is one of the most celebrated narrative historians of our time. He is the author of 8 powerful volumes of American military history, including the Pulitzer Prize winning An Army at Dawn, which launched his Liberation Trilogy, the final volume of which is The Guns at Last Light. His current project, the Revolution Trilogy, is already considered a landmark in Revolutionary War history, with the first volume, The British Are Coming, earning widespread acclaim. The second installment, The Fate of the Day, was released this year, debuting at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Mr. Atkinson's writing is admired for its elegance, its vivid portrayal of people and events, and its commitment to deep research. A former senior editor and foreign correspondent for the Washington Post, he has also earned Pulitzer Prizes for national reporting and public service journalism. His contributions to military history and public understanding of war are unmatched, and we're truly honored to have him here today. Together, Dan and Mr. Atkinson will guide us through a conversation about leadership, conflict, and the ways in which 1945 and its legacy continue to shape our national identity. So please join me in welcoming them both to the Museum and Visitor Center.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you to Chris and Jackie. And yes, I did tell Chris to keep it short. Thank you all for joining us here. We're honored to have you here with us as we begin our 2025 World War II weekend event. And we're honored to have you here with us tonight, Rick. Looking forward to our conversation here. We'll talk for a while. We'll have a chance to open this up for some question and answer from our audience here tonight. And then after tonight's program, we will have a book signing as well. We just ask that everyone give Rick a few moments to get to the book signing table before we all leave our seats and head out of the theater here this evening. But Rick, to start tonight, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about your interest in history and where it originated. Your father was a U.S. Army officer who served from the Second World War through Vietnam, stationed all around the United States and the world. How did that shape your interests growing up around the world the Second World War made?
Thank you for having me, Dan, and thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm an Army brat. I was born in Munich. We lived in Salzburg, actually, the first 3 years of my life. And as you say, we moved around a lot. My father's last job in the Army was teaching right up the road at the Army War College. So they lived in Carlisle for the last 40 years of their long lives. So I live in Washington, D.C., so I've made that trek up Highway 15 over and over again. I think the fact that I grew up on Army posts kindled my interest in military things, not surprisingly. When I started working in newspapers, I was a newspaper reporter in a small town in Kansas first, and then Kansas City, and then the Washington Post. I found that reporters my age and younger generally had no military experience. Those who were older had been subject to the draft, and so did have military experience, usually not voluntarily. And so I was immediately, because I knew the difference between an F-16 and an M16, I knew the lingo, I know the culture. I was immediately given assignments. The first day at the Washington Post in November 1983, I was told to go to Hunter Army Airfield outside of Savannah, because there was some general who was going to give a briefing on what had happened during the invasion of Grenada, which had happened about 2 weeks before that. For you younger people here who don't know where Grenada is, it's in the Caribbean, and we invaded it in October 1983. So this is my first day at the Washington Post. So I go to Savannah, I go to Hunter Army Airfield, and the general who's giving the first public briefing about what had happened in Grenada. The military had not allowed reporters to go, and they had said almost nothing about what had happened. There were a lot of people killed. That general's name was H. Norman Schwarzkopf. He was a major general then, and he would go on to be the commander of forces in the Persian Gulf War in 1990-91. So I was given assignments like that a lot, writing about when I was still in Kansas City, I got interested in one particular West Point class, you have this tome right here, class of 1966 at West Point. They lost more men in Vietnam than any other West Point class. 30 of them were killed. And by chance, my father's closest friend in the Army was a general named Red Fuller. Red had a son, Mike, who was in the class of 66. And I had grown up hearing about the class of 66. And on one occasion, Mike started telling me in greater detail about what had happened to his class, to him and that class, both before, during, and after West Point. So I wrote about it in Kansas City. I wrote a newspaper series. 5 years later, I'm at the Washington Post. 5 years have given me enough time, I think, to have the chops to be able to do it as a book, big book. So I did. I took it on as a book, and that was the first of what are now 8. So I think, fate leads you in odd ways that you don't always anticipate. I thought I wanted to teach college English. I was in graduate school in English literature, and I've spent my entire professional life writing about war instead.
So those experiences as a journalist that you had prior to your writing of these volumes, on numerous occasions you were covering combat zones fairly up close. Persian Gulf War, Somalia, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. How do those experiences seeing more modern combat prepare you to write about combat that's taking place 80 years ago in the Second World War or in the more recent trilogy 250 years ago?
Yeah, Dan, I actually think it's useful. I think that it works on several levels. First of all, I have some experience, very intimate experience, as you suggest, of what it's like to get shot at. Shot at and missed. That's the best feeling in the world. Also, I've had a number of experiences where I am able to study leadership in real time. So, for example, in 2003, I went with Dave Petraeus, whom I had known initially when he was a major. In 2003, he was a major general. He had just taken command of the 101st Airborne Division. I was between books, and my uppers and betters at the Post suggested that if I was interested, I should get ready to go to Iraq if push came to shove in Iraq. So I called Petraeus, whom I didn't know very well then, and I said, I'm general shopping. And I hear from my friends at the Pentagon that the 101st is likely to have a major role if push comes to shove. Can I go with you? And he said, as he, typically would, yes, come on, let's go. So I was with him every day for 2 months, from the time the 101st left Fort Campbell, Kentucky at the end of February 2003 through the fall of Baghdad, with him every day, shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, either in the back of his Humvee or on the Black Hawk helicopter. He'd never been in combat. Like Eisenhower, he had missed the previous war. Eisenhower missed World War I. In Petraeus' case, he missed the Persian Gulf War. He was what in the Army, those of you who are military know this, clean sleeve, no combat patch on the right shoulder. It really bugged him, And so watching him, having never had a shot fired in anger at him, wrestle with all the things that leaders have to wrestle with in combat, I think is illuminating for me as a writer, whether I'm writing about Eisenhower in World War II or Washington in the American Revolution or men down the ranks. There are certain eternal verities of leadership under the stress of combat, and there is no greater stress on earth that a human can be subjected to than to be responsible for the lives of subordinates under combat. So that's one level, and I think it has been illuminating for me. Other things like, the small things, the importance of sleep discipline. If you don't get enough sleep, you make bad decisions. And if you make bad decisions as a leader in the military, you get people killed, your soldiers killed. So watching, I was in Somalia 3 times. I was in Bosnia a couple times, Iraq a couple times, including that long stint with Petraeus. Watching those leaders force themselves to get sufficient sleep, knowing that if they didn't, they were in danger of endangering the lives of soldiers. Sleep discipline, light discipline. Again, those of you who are in the military know that if you're in proximity to the enemy, you don't want them to know where you are, and that means not any light whatsoever at night. And watching how they do that in the 101st Airborne Division, for example, in Najaf or Karbala or other places on the fringe of the Euphrates Valley, is very interesting to me. And again, it's illuminating. It's something that soldiers in the American Revolution would understand perfectly well. Sleep discipline, light discipline, the pressures of leadership. So I think it has served me pretty well.
So your background, growing up with your father's career is formative. Your journalist career is formative. I'm curious, who are the military history writers or writers that you like to read? What are some of your literary influences that you enjoy reading that help craft these works?
Well, I mentioned I was an English literature major, so I like to read fiction, actually. That doesn't help me because, I can't write fiction. I read lots of military history, and I read, of necessity, most of the reading that I do is of stuff from, in this case, 250 years ago. But Gettysburg, for instance, Alan Guelzo, terrific book on Gettysburg, really just a brilliant book. Stephen Sears before that. Shelby Foote, who had been a novelist, wrote 3 volumes on the Civil War. It's about 3,000 pages. And I go back and I've read the whole thing and I've listened to the whole thing. And I go back and I listen periodically. Just last week, I've been in London and Madrid in the last week, and I was listening to Shelby Foote's just at random, because there's something about the way that he describes combat that I just find very evocative. His 80 pages on Gettysburg is really pretty spectacular. By the way, 3,000 pages on the Civil War and 0 footnotes. You can't get away with that today. I read the masters. I'm close friends with Sir Max Hastings, a British ex-journalist turned prolific military historian. Also, Sir Anthony Beevor, former British Army officer, excellent military historian and a very fine writer. So I read the guys who are good, and try to steal away to read fiction that has nothing to do with war periodically.
So in the current works that you are publishing, with The Fate of the Day coming out most recently, the 2nd volume in your Revolution Trilogy, how has that process of writing a trilogy on the Revolution compared to the Second World War? What have been some of the maybe things about the process that have surprised you or challenges along the way? Obviously, there's vastly different source material for these eras.
Yeah, well, I'm 2/3 of the way through the second trilogy in my life, and I have to say, what was I thinking? Because I spent 15 years on the World War II trilogy. I've now put in 12 on the American Revolution, and I have a book to go, and I'm older and slower. You're right. The source material comes from entirely different places. So the archives that I thought I had mastered pretty well for World War II, having spent almost 15 years in those archives, and I am an archive rat. It's how I make my living. And if you don't like the solitude of archives and the mystery of the next unopened archival box is not something that gets you up in the morning, then don't try it. But the archives for World War II turn out to be largely useless for the American Revolution. It's a whole different set of archives. And I kind of knew that intellectually, but now I know it emotionally. So that's been quite different. And again, you have to learn to master the archives. So in July, I was in London the first time this summer, and I spent a week at the British Library. I spent a lot of time at places like Kew, the British National Archive, both for World War II and the American Revolution. That's one of the few places where it overlaps. The biggest, best archive in the United States for the American Revolution material is in, of all places, Ann Arbor, Michigan. The William Clements Library. William Clements was a wealthy Michigan industrialist who was a collector. And in the 19-teens, he began buying up the papers of British generals and British statesmen from the Revolutionary War era. So and typically their families said, we don't want these things, these losing generals. And they'd often fallen on hard times, the families had, and they're looking for some money from Clemens. So the papers, for example, of Thomas Gage, who was the British commanding general in Boston at the time the war began at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, those papers are in Ann Arbor. The papers of George Germain, who was the American secretary, former British general. He's the Robert McNamara of the war for King George III. They're in Ann Arbor. The papers of Henry Clinton, who was a British commanding general for 4 years during the American Revolution, longer than any other general. Those papers are in Ann Arbor. So, there's that, the archival differences. The volume of material is vastly different. In World War II, some underemployed scholar once calculated that the papers for the United States Army, one service, one country, weigh 17,000 tons. That's a lot of paper. A lot of it's up in Carlisle at what they used to call the Military History Institute, now AHEC, the Army Heritage and Education Center. Fantastic archive, particularly for World War II and Vietnam. You compare that, and of course there were 16.4 million Americans in uniform in World War II, compared to probably about 200,000 in the Continental Army in the American Revolution. So, and in World War II, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines were forbidden from keeping diaries for security reasons, and so they all did. And so the collection of diaries and letters, as well as official papers, is it's extraordinary. And it's much sparser for the Revolution. The Americans were very literate in the 1770s, much more literate than the Brits generally. Literacy was higher in the colonies than in Britain, but there were many fewer keeping diaries. The collection of letters is much less. The founders' papers are beautifully maintained and curated. Washington's by the University of Virginia, Franklin's by Yale, for example, and they're all online now, which is an extraordinary advantage. But at any rate, it's a lot different in that regard too, Dan. So, but it's war. So whether you're writing, Thucydides, 2,500 years ago would recognize a lot of the same things that we're talking about now, including leadership, including stress, including all of these things. And so even though I'm writing about a war that was in the 1770s and wrote at length about a war that was in the 1940s, there are a lot of similarities.
Well, that's where my next question was going, differences and similarities. And all these years of warfare from the Revolution and the Second World War, one of the similarities that I find in these works is the thread of strong leadership and the relative similarities of Dwight Eisenhower and George Washington. What are the values that you think that maybe they had in common that made them such central figures for each of these trilogies?
Well, on the face of it, they're completely different, aren't they? Washington is to the manor born. He's one of the richest men in Virginia. He's of the elite planter class. Then he marries the richest widow in Virginia, and then he's got real money. He has seen a lot of combat, unlike Eisenhower. 5 years of the French and Indian War as a Virginia militia colonel, always under his superior British command, but he saw a lot of killing. Eisenhower, born in Texas, raised in Abilene, Kansas. Father's failed merchant, more sons than you can count in that family. So from very modest circumstances, he goes to West Point not because he wants to be Napoleon, but because it's free. He misses World War I, and he's here. That's why he had an affection for Gettysburg. That's why he eventually bought the farm here. He was posted here briefly after World War I. And at that point, he's thinking, maybe I'm going to get out of the Army. He's class of 1915 from West Point, and at one point he writes a letter to his family. This is a little later, and he says, I've had, it's been good, but I think maybe I'm getting out. Well, he goes from lieutenant colonel to 5-star general in 42 months. So their backgrounds are quite different. As generals, you're right, they have a lot in common. The first thing I would mention is, what is the trait that Napoleon most cherished in his generals? Anybody know? Luck. Luck. Never to be underestimated in life, really never to be underestimated in war. And so they're both lucky. And they're lucky in the trajectory of their careers, and they're lucky at various points in their lives. Americans don't really, luck is the residue of preparation, right? Okay, sometimes it's just luck. They have, what are their characteristics? Big brains organized for executive action, willingness to take responsibility, willingness to make decisions. Both very articulate, orally and in writing. We think of Eisenhower as being kind of this syntax mangling. Churchill, who knew something about articulation, at one point says of Eisenhower, it is not usual to find generals who are so precise as he is when they speak. You rarely left the presence of either Eisenhower or Washington as a subordinate without knowing precisely what the boss wanted. That's a real skill, and so they had that in common. Good eyes for subordinate talent. Washington sees a 25-year-old overweight Boston bookseller named Henry Knox and somehow intuits this guy's going to be the father of American artillery. He sees a 34-year-old lapsed Quaker from Rhode Island named Nathaniel Greene, who has gone from being private in the Rhode Island militia, where he cannot get elected lieutenant of his company, and suddenly he's a brigadier general. Washington sees him early in the war in Cambridge, outside of Boston, the first couple months of the Revolution, and somehow intuits this guy's got something. And what that guy has got, Nathaniel Greene, is he's going to be second only to Washington as the indispensable man in the Continental Army. Unknown to many Americans today, which is criminal. So good eyes for subordinate talent. Robust. Washington, 8 years of war. The American Revolution lasts for 8 years. He goes back to Mount Vernon once, and only for a couple nights in the course of those 8 years. He never seems to catch cold. Eisenhower's the same way, even though at the time of Normandy, he's smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day. And he does get, he has a cough occasionally, but for the most part, both robust, project vigor, which is important. They both have command presence. Washington in particular, he's 6'2", at an age when the average American male is maybe 5'7". When you come into his presence in a room, there's no question who's in command. Eisenhower, Eisenhower's 5'10", but he's physically robust. He's got broad shoulders. Again, this command presence is important. They both have it. So those are some of the things that I would say that they have in common, and there are others.
In your final book of the Liberation Trilogy, The Guns at Last Light, you wrote this about Eisenhower. Eisenhower's avowed #1 plan after the war was to sit on the bank of a quiet stream and fish. That would not happen. The victorious commander was destined for grander things. And I'll note that some of those grander things are taking place here in Gettysburg at his farm when he is President of the United States. You had a chance to tour the home this afternoon. I'm curious what your thoughts of the Eisenhower home were.
Yeah, of all the times I've been here to the battlefield and all the times I've blasted past on US 15 going to see my parents in Carlisle or going to the Army War College, I've never seen the farm until this afternoon. So thank you for making that happen. It's preserved in amber, isn't it? You really have a feeling it's basically a 1950s house. And his office alone, if you've been there, the office is the size of a phone booth, basically. It's very unpretentious. The home itself is nice, and it's got, it's 4,000 square feet, so it's not small, but it's like Eisenhower generally, I think, unpretentious. It's his equivalent of sitting on the bank of a stream and fishing. There is a putting green out back. He would do skeet shooting, trap or skeet, whatever. I don't know him well as a president, much less as a former president, but I can see the former general there. There's a lot of books in the house. He was a reader, middle brow, but I think a diligent reader. Again, that big brain. I thought it was interesting that very few of his World War II pals came to visit. Montgomery came. I would like to have been a fly on the wall to hear that conversation. Because Eisenhower had very little hair during World War II, and after his encounters with Montgomery, he had none. Because it was a very fraught relationship, a complex relationship. But apparently Omar Bradley never visited. These are West Point classmates from the class of 1915, and they were joined at the hip during the war. Patton, of course, is dead. Alan Nevins had been on his staff, and he was a friend after the war, but he basically had left that part of his life behind, I think. So at any rate, I'm so pleased that the Park Service has done such a good job of preserving it. I think it really is, a significant historical site, and preserving it in amber is exactly how it should be preserved.
You also quote Marshall's praise to Eisenhower at the war's end. Quote, "You have completed your mission with the greatest victory in the history of warfare. You have made history, great history for the good of all mankind, and you have stood for all we hope for and admire in an officer of the United States Army." And as you noted before, Eisenhower had never seen combat, yet he was praised by George Marshall as embodying everything we hope for and admire in an officer of the United States Army. I know we've been talking about some of his strengths and qualities, but are there other things that you think that for Eisenhower were essential in embodying that spirit of an officer of the Army?
That praise from Marshall, who was not one given to just tossing out plaudits, is really extraordinary. And I find it one of the most touching tributes any superior could ever give to a subordinate. One other thing I should say about that Eisenhower and Washington had in common, and it touches on your question, Dan, neither one of them are particularly good tacticians. Washington makes a lot of mistakes. He doesn't read the ground well. This is a guy who made a living as a surveyor. You would think that reading the ground would be part of his game, but the Battle of Long Island, he doesn't go out and recon the terrain, and he gets outflanked by the British and nearly loses his entire army. Same thing happens at Brandywine. Not too far from here. He doesn't go out and recon the ground himself. Again by General Howe, he gets outflanked and nearly loses his army. Eisenhower, he's not a tactical commander in the same way that Washington is, but there are several occasions when he is on the ground, on the scene, when decisions are being made where he should have recognized that the wrong decisions are being made. One example, there are 4 German divisions in Sicily, along with a lot of Italians. We invade Sicily with the British in July of 1943, and those 4 German divisions get away. They all get away. They fight hard for 6 weeks, and they all get away, and we fight them over and over and over again in Italy. And a lot of American soldiers are killed by those 4 divisions during the subsequent awful slog up the boot of Italy. And there are other occasions when Eisenhower is there, and he doesn't get it. Got to put that in the negative column, I suppose, for both of them. Now, in both cases, they have bigger fish to fry. Eisenhower in particular, he is the supreme Allied commander. It's the big arrows on the map. Washington also is doing the big arrows on the map. He's also moving around regiments, because that's the way things are organized in the 18th century. And it's where those big arrows on the map, it's where they are both extraordinarily capable at integrating foreign forces into their command. Both of them recognize, the old Churchill dictum, which obviously Washington never heard because Churchill's much later, but the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. Washington knows that when the French come into the war on our side, and then the Spanish are going to come into the war, and then the Dutch are going to come into the war, all against the British. And Washington is really quite brilliant. He doesn't speak French, but he's got this 19-year-old kid named Lafayette who shows up. And then other French officers are going to show up, and they're going to be absolutely instrumental. We don't win the war. We don't win Yorktown in October 1781 without the French. And Washington really knows the importance of this. Eisenhower is the same way. And I think that goes in part to the praise that is heaped on him by Marshall. Ultimately, the United Nations, small u, small n, as Franklin Roosevelt called it, the Allied forces, are 60 nations. And Eisenhower is responsible in part not only for getting along with Montgomery and the Brits, which is a full-time job in and of itself, but the French, which is another full-time job, de Gaulle. But he's got Norwegians, he's got Poles, he's got Italians, he's got the Free French, he's got, not all 60 nations are there in Eisenhower's headquarters, but there are a lot. And he's absolutely terrific at it. It's our first and in some ways our most important diplomatic lesson as a country. Benjamin Franklin was sent to France to persuade the French, a Roman Catholic absolute monarchy, that it was in the best interest of Louis XVI and his regime to align himself and themselves with Protestant wannabe Republicans intent on armed rebellion against their lawful monarch. That's a heavy lift diplomatically. And he's brilliant at it. And what Franklin showed, and what Washington understood, and what later Eisenhower understood, is the best team usually wins. The best team usually wins. We had the best team in the American Revolution. The British were alone. They had no allies. Since 1763, their only friend in Europe was Portugal, and the Portuguese deserted them in 1782. So we have the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and other European nations are helping on the side or under the table. It's World War I, the best team won. World War II, the best team won. We should think about that the next time we give a thumb in the eye to our closest friends today. We're going to need them. It's stupid. The best team wins. It's the oldest lesson in American diplomatic history, a lesson that these generals knew very well.
It's been now 10 years or over 10 years since your Liberation Trilogy was finished. In reflecting back on it and the journey of that trilogy from North Africa to Sicily to Italy to Normandy all the way to Germany itself, in all of those theaters and campaigns, is there one moment in time that stands out to you through that trilogy as most critical to the Allied victory 80 years ago?
I think the first campaign in North Africa turns out to be really vital. Not so much because of what was accomplished tactically, although that was really important, but because several things happened in North Africa. First of all, we're in North Africa. What the hell are we doing in North Africa? That's what Eisenhower and other American generals wanted to know. We went to North Africa because there were no Germans there. Franklin Roosevelt was convinced by Winston Churchill that the best way for the green American army with green leaders to ease into the war in Europe was to start at a place where they could be amateurs. And so, and North Africa had certain potential advantages, and Roosevelt overrode the advice of virtually everyone in the military high command, starting with George Marshall. Eisenhower, when Roosevelt, I think it was July 25th, 1942, issued the order that we're going to North Africa, a combined British-American invasion force going to North Africa. Eisenhower wrote in his diary, "This is the blackest day in history." Given the blackness of other days, that's a ridiculous overstatement, and it turns out to be quite untrue. The invasion of North Africa in November of 1942 shows how unprepared Americans really were, even though our adversary on that day, November 8th, 1942, is not the Germans, it's not the Italians, it's the French. The French occupied North Africa, and as part of the deal deal with the devil that they've made when Hitler invaded metropolitan France, is they were allowed to keep their colonies, including Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, with the proviso that the French would repel any invaders, whoever those invaders happened to be. Well, the invaders happened to be us. And so we fought pretty vigorously against the French for 3 days. 1,000 French sailors died on November 8th, 1942. So in North Africa is where the alliance begins to come together. It's where Americans and British begin to work together, or butt heads together, all the things that you have to go through to really weld an Anglo-American alliance of some sort. It's where the leaders whose names we now know emerge: Patton, Bradley, Eisenhower, and there are others. Lucian Truscott is a brigadier general on November 8th, 1942. He's going to end up as a 4-star. He is maybe the best combat leader in the United States Army in World War II. So, North Africa, it's relatively small when we start, but there are 1 million soldiers in North Africa by May of 1943, when the Germans and Italians are defeated and armies captured in Tunisia, and we control the Mediterranean. And that's important strategically because it opens up the Suez Canal. It's only 100 miles from Sicily, which is the next stopping point. Sicily is going to be a giant air base for taking the war through bombing campaigns from Sicily, and particularly from southern Italy, Foggia, and places like that, into the heart of Germany. So, I think in an odd way, it's vitally important, that first campaign in 42-43.
Well, and without learning those lessons, much like Washington early in the Revolution, he learns vital lessons through setbacks. Eisenhower learns vital lessons through setbacks that begets later success.
Eisenhower thinks he's going to be relieved of command.
Yeah.
It's not going well. This is even before the Battle of Kasserine Pass, which was a surprise counterattack orchestrated by Rommel and Arnhem, and it drove the American army back 80 miles. It's the biggest loss of yardage in World War II, more than at the Battle of the Bulge. And Eisenhower writes to his son John, who is about to graduate from West Point, it may be necessary for my superiors to relieve me of command. If this happens, and these things do happen in war, and I don't want you to worry about it. Patton, who's his closest pal, while sniping at him behind his back all the time, Patton says, "Ike thinks his thread's about to be cut." Well, it didn't happen. It didn't happen in part because the British liked him. He was one of the very, very few American generals who was not an Anglophobe. I mean, Patton, Bradley, they all detested the British. And Eisenhower, he liked him. He started using words like petrol and tiffin. It drove Patton insane. And the British didn't, they wanted him around, partly because they thought they could control him, which they couldn't. So yeah, they're dancing between ice flows to some extent in North Africa.
So he goes from thinking he's going to be relieved in North Africa to several years later, May of '45, accepting the surrender of Nazi Germany. I have one more question, then we'll open it up here. At the end of The Guns at Last Light, you have a line quoting, "War is not over until the last soldier passes away from that war." You conclude with this quote, reflecting on the loss of our World War II veterans, who are dwindling in number each year.
There's less than 50,000 now.
Yeah, each year for World War II weekend, for many years, the event featured veterans speaking. We're hoping a few will join us to visit the site tomorrow during the event. But referring to the final veterans passing, you conclude with this line: "Yet the war and all that the war contained, nobility, villainy, immeasurable sorrows, is certain to live on even after the last old soldier has gone to his grave. May the earth lie lightly on his bones." I picked that quote because, first of all, it's beautiful writing. Writing history in a way that people want to read is never a bad thing. But we're also at this crucial moment in the memory of World War II, much as the nation was at one time for every conflict we've ever fought, where our veterans are passing and we're reflecting on the meaning of it. With the loss of veterans, how does that impact our memories of this conflict? How does that impact how we commemorate conflicts like the Second World War?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dan. I think it's an open question. I'm on the board of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and have been for 20 years, and it's a question they're wrestling with. You know, they've got 7 pavilions in this big campus down there, and one of the issues is when that generation is gone. By the way, I never call it the greatest generation, which I think is, with all due respect to my pal Tom Brokaw, who coined that phrase in 1998. I think it's nonsense. And that's no disrespect to that generation, but greater than the founders, greater than the Civil War generation who fought right out here? I don't think so. We've been lucky in our national history to have a succession of generations that have risen to the task, including those 2 World War II generations. Obviously it's up to their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren now to keep the memory alive of what they did, to keep the national sense of gratitude in place, to keep alive the recognition that this country is, ridiculously screwed up as it often is, including today. Has the capacity to encounter existential threats and overcome them with a show of remarkable unity. There's 340 million of us today, folks. There were 140 million in World War II. 340 million of us, and if we all put our shoulder to the wheel, we could do anything. Well, that's not happening today, it's not happening tomorrow, but the memory of the country being able to overcome extraordinary odds, whether it's in the Revolution fighting against the British Empire with the greatest navy the world has ever seen in the Royal Navy, or overcoming the stress fractures of the Civil War, where the nation's very existence is on the table, and the issue of whether or not a house divided against itself cannot stand. And that house could not be built on the abomination of slavery. Or whether it's World War II, where you're confronted with global fascism of a sort that is murderous and a threat to everything that we hold dear. We've risen to the occasion, and so I think it should be part of our birthright as Americans, having the good fortune to be born here or to have come here and become citizens here, to take on these challenges and to use the model of our forebears as a propulsion system, knowing that we've got the capacity to do extraordinary things in extraordinary moments. So this is something to pass on to our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren.
I agree. Well, Rick, I'm loath to end our chat here, but I do want to make sure we have time for our book signing afterwards. In closing, I want to again thank you for joining us here, and thank you for giving us so many of these books, which I know I'm speaking on behalf of my friends and colleagues, that so many of us cherish because they provide us connections with the past. They bring these people long dead back to life for us. It's with our World War II weekend, one of our goals is for our visitors and our volunteers and our staff and everybody to be able to connect with this generation again for the weekend. So we hope folks will come on out and visit us this weekend. We'll have great weather, which we can't always say, but we'll have great weather this weekend. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for this just wonderful conversation. And on behalf of the National Park Service and our friends at the Gettysburg Foundation, I want to present you with a challenge coin for this year's event and say thank you.
Thank you.
And folks, if you'll give us just a minute to get set up for our book signing this evening, we'll get Rick up to the tables. Just stay in your seats for just a few moments. We'll get everything in place, and you'll have a chance to come on up and get your book signed. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.